Hi everyone, this is Rayon Paper. Today we will be continuing the ink swatching series with our second selection of purple inks. While we have both darker and lighter inks, most of these are definitely a bit warmer toned. We have a bit of sheen, a few shimmer inks, and even one scented ink. As always, I'll be using a glass of water, my Pilot Iro Uchishi dip pen in fine, my makeshift sample file holder, and an old towel. I'll be swatching on 52 GSM Tomoe River paper. And with all of that said, let's get swatching. The first ink is Monteverde Chameleon. Chameleon is part of Monteverde's line of jungle inks, all named after various animals. Chameleon is a very deep, dark purple ink. It's not super saturated, but it has a warm, reddish undertone. In larger swatches, the ink develops a dark, greenish sheen, but that doesn't really show up in writing. Chameleon has some lovely shading, even though it's a darker ink. It's worth noting that the ink has quite a wet flow. Then we have Jacques Herbin Poussière de Lune. With Poussière de Lune or moon dust, we have another purple that is not all that saturated. When dry, the ink looks fairly similar to Monteverde Chameleon. Poussière de Lune is a bit lighter and perhaps a bit red-leaning, a bit more towards a sort of true purple. It has no sheen, but it does shade a bit. Unlike some of the lighter Jacques Herbin inks, Poussière de Lune isn't a dry writer at all. If anything, I'd say it's quite a wet ink. Our third ink is Jacques Herbin Améthyste de l'Ural. This is the first of the 4 shimmer inks we have today, and named after the amethysts from the Ural Mountains, this ink is more of a royal purple. It has a silver shimmer that helps convey the glistening qualities of an amethyst, and it also has some golden sheen. Overall, I think this is a nice ink, however, I'm not crazy about the combination of the silver shimmer and the golden sheen. Then we have Diamine Deck the Holes. Deck the Holes was first introduced in the 2022 Green Inkfant calendar. Compared to Améthyste de l'Ural, the base color of Deck the Holes is less saturated and has more red, more like Poussière de Lune. The one thing I like most about Deck the Holes, however, is its chameleon shimmer. The shimmer is a sort of a pink meets copper. I want to say rose gold, but that's not quite it. It's festive, it's elegant, it's warm, it's cozy. I like it a lot. Next up is Diamine Frosted Orchid. Remember that praise for Deck the Holes? Yeah, Frosted Orchid isn't getting any of that. That's not the ink's fault, of course, but it's not really my color. Frosted Orchid is on the lighter side, somewhere between purple and lilac. The ink has quite a lot of silver shimmer. The silver shimmer fits the theme of the name as it gives the ink an icy look, but I just keep thinking this ink would look nicer with golden shimmer. The ink has a good flow, however, and it has some really lovely shading. Ink number 6 is Diamine Tranquility, the last shimmer ink for today. Tranquility was introduced in last year's Purple Inkfant calendar. The base color of this ink is similar to that of Frosted Orchid, but punchier, more vibrant. It also has a bit of shading, but its most interesting quality is that chameleon shimmer. Depending on the angle of the light, the shimmer will appear either coppery, golden-ish, or bright green. Now, green shimmer in a purple ink is not really my favorite combination, but it definitely has personality. Ink number 7 is Rohrer and Klingner Alt-Bordeaux. If the last 4 inks were a bit too much Christmas tree, casino, or fun fair for you, we'll take it down a notch with Alt-Bordeaux. Alt-Bordeaux, which means Old Bordeaux in German, is a lovely warm purple. It's not really a Bordeaux color, I think, as I expect those to be way more red. But the ink has a nice bit of shading, it has good flow, and it's a little bit more on the wet side. Then we have Atramentis Iris. Atramentis Iris is our only scented ink for today. The color of Iris is quite similar to Alt-Bordeaux. It's a little darker, a little less saturated. It's quite a wet ink with little shading, which honestly looks a little flat after writing, but while you are writing, however, you'll be greeted with quite a strong floral scent. Now I must admit, I don't know if this actually smells like irises, but I do find it a nice scent. I would have liked it to be a little less overbearing, perhaps. Next up is Diamine Tyrian Purple. Diamine Tyrian Purple is a classic, and for good reason. It's the most red-leaning ink so far. It's neither dark nor light, which is usually a category that has really good shading inks. Tyrian Purple, however, doesn't really shade much at all. Unfortunately, I wanted to add, but maybe you don't like shading all that much, and you're glad that this is more of a standard, flatter ink. I think the color of this ink is really pretty though, so perhaps it just doesn't need anything extra. The next ink is Sailor Harahara. Harahara is part of the Shikiori line of Sailor inks, which are linked to the seasons. And Harahara is an onomatopoeia. It stands for the sound of rain coming down rapidly in big drops. According to Sailor, this is what rain sounds like in autumn. In terms of the ink itself, Harahara is a dusty, muted purple that has some warm undertones. It shades nicely and has a subtle dark brown sheen. It's very well behaved and I think it's a joy to write with. Then we have Diamine Händel. Händel, named after the composer George Friedrich Händel, is part of the music line of Diamine inks. The color of the ink is fairly similar to that of Diamine Tyrian Purple. Händel, however, is more saturated, making the ink appear more vibrant. While this color leans more towards a magenta, it still retains some of those dusty qualities. In terms of shading, as well as the flow of the ink, it is again comparable to Diamine Tyrian Purple. Personally, I like Diamine Tyrian Purple a little better, but they're both lovely inks. Ink number 12 is Diamine Amaranth. Just like Händel was more saturated and vibrant than Tyrian Purple, Amaranth is another step in the same direction. It's one of those colors that I find very hard to categorize. In my opinion, it's not yet pink enough to be a magenta, not yet red enough to be a burgundy, but it's not a perfect fit amongst these purples either. That does make it quite a unique color in my collection, however. I think the name is a really good fit, depending on the cultivar of Amaranth you're most familiar with. The ink shades nicely and has a tiny bit of sheen. We have 3 more inks on the next page, with the first one being Diamine Writer's Blood. Writer's Blood was developed in collaboration with the fountainpen subreddit, and it looks a bit like the famous Diamine Ox Blood, but way more purple. Both inks remind me of red wine colors. It has a bit of sheen, in this case brownish, but not much shading. It's worth noting that this is a very wet ink. I don't know if it's because of the name or the color, but I can't wait to ink this up around Halloween this year. Then we have our last Diamine ink for today, namely Diamine Merlot. This is not necessarily the color I think of when I hear the word Merlot, but maybe it's not so much inspired by the wine itself, but the color of the grape. Whatever the inspiration was, this is a very nice ink. It's very unsaturated with strong red undertones. In bigger swatches, the ink has a bit of greenish, brownish sheen, but not really in writing. Color-wise, I don't really have anything to compare this to except for the next ink. Next up is Barock Kaviar. Barock Kaviar is another very unsaturated purple ink. In terms of the color, it's similar to Diamine Merlot, but Merlot is a bit warmer, more red, whereas Barock Kaviar can sometimes appear almost brown. The biggest difference, however, is the shading. While Merlot barely shades, Kaviar has great shading. The contrast between the lightest and darkest parts is quite big, which I tend to enjoy in an ink. In bigger swatches, the ink has some sheen that is almost black. And that's it, another 15 inks. From these inks, I mostly enjoy the less saturated ones, such as Sailor Harahara and Barock Kaviar. The shading in Kaviar is especially fun, and Harahara is an almost perfect shade of warm, dusty purple for me. In the next ink swatching video, we're going to take a look at the last set of purple inks, or should I say blurple inks. Most of these will be blue-leaning purples, or purple-leaning blues. Enjoy this little recording of the page now that all the inks have dried completely and you can really see all the shading, the sheen and the shimmer. I hope you enjoyed this video and I would love to hear what your favorite purple ink is. Be sure to subscribe to the channel if you don't want to miss the rest of the series, and I hope to see you in the next one. Take care. Bye!